Hello, my name's Toby Litt. I teach creative writing at Birkbeck, and I'd like to talk to you today about a couple of birds in a couple of books. One is a greenfinch that appears in Patience, which is the novel I published this year, and the other is a lyre bird, and it appears in a wonderful book, Translations from the Natural World by the Australian poet Les Murray, which came out in the early 90s. They're both quite tongue-twisty readings. They're both quite difficult, and I'm going to start with them, and then I'm just going to talk about them afterwards. So I'm going to start with the Greenfinch. What you need to know is that the narrator of the book, who's talking about the Greenfinch, is called Elliot. He's a 13-year-old boy, and he lives in a Catholic children's home. The year is 1979, and Elliot has cerebral palsy. He can't move except just for the fingers of one hand. And he's put by the sisters who look after him, the nuns, in one of two places. He's either facing a white wall, that's if he's been too overexcited the day before, or he's facing a courtyard down through a window with a windowsill. And sometimes onto that windowsill, birds land. And Eliot treasures the memories of these birds. He indexes them almost. And when he's in a feeling of distress, or when he's in a feeling of elation and wants to distract himself, calm himself down, he'll think of one of those memories. He'll go through the Rolodex of his mind and come up with a bird to think about. He thinks of them as eruptions of colour, eruptions of joy, of vision. And this is the greenfinch that he decides to think about when he's trying to distract himself on this particular day. What can you think when out of the whole universe, right in front of you, small and light, yet absolute and infinite in detail, appears such a beauty of a bird that even a voice from behind you, luckily not loud enough to scare it off, Sister Claire saying, "Oh look, a greenfinch," and the name was a gift to me as much as the 3.5 more minutes the green vision danced and fretted and eagered and preened in front of me. I could not believe, who could believe, that I deserved so many feathers that overlapped in such a succinct way and that slid over one another in greens that were doorways to shy, sly gardens of other greens that tree green had only hinted at. It was not just that I had never seen anything quite so perfectly what it was. No, it was that I felt that by its being there, I too was allowed fleetingly to participate in perfection, because my eyes, my gorgeous seeing eyes, were able to see the details in the details of the greenfinch, at the same time as seeing the greenness of its greens. And as much as it was outside on the windowsill above the radiator, so much more was it inside my eyes, and so creating a perfect greenfinch forever in my head. That's Eliot's Greenfinch. Now I'm going to read straight away the Lyre Bird from Translations from the Natural World. I saw Les Murray read this poem and other poems a couple of times, and he had quite a matter-of-fact way about him. Obviously, he's an Australian poet, so his accent was different. Some of the ways he'd say some of the words in this were different. But he was always very punctilious. He always wanted to get the sound right. He didn't want to lose any of the nuances of the sound, and it's a very nuanced poem. It's also incredibly, incredibly complicated in terms of sound and syntax, and it wants to trip you up. So I'm going to try and not be tripped up and try and read it without an Australian accent, but a bit like Les would have read it. So, Lyre Bird. Lyre, made of leaf litter, quivering, ribby and shim, hen-sized under frou-frou, chinks in a quiff display him or her, dancing in mating time or out, and in any order. Tailed mimic aeon sent to intrigue the next recorder. I mew catbird, I soar crosscut, I howl she-dingo, I kink forest hush distinct with bellbirds. Warble magpie garble link cattle bell with kettle boil. I rank duck's cranky presidium, or simulate a triller like a rill mirrored lyrical to a rim. I ring dim, I alter nothing. Reel to reel only I sing. Garn the crane to gun the chainsaw, urban thing to being. Screaming woman owl and human talk. EDI and Udian unknown. The miming is all of I. Silent, they are a function of wet forest, cometary lyre birds. Their flight lifts them barely a semitone. So, what do the two things have in common? Well, for me, there's a sound in the middle of them both. There's a sound which I think unconsciously I stole. In the Lyre Bird, we get to a certain point and we think that we have gone through all the show-off words, crosscut, she dingo, I kink, forest hush, distinct with bellbirds. And for me, the word that seems to rhyme with that, literally, but also in terms of the approach, is the word distinct in this description. My description has a bird that's being seen as a memory. It's being seen as something treasured. And the sense that Les Murray gives when he's writing is that each bird, each character of an animal is its own universe. It's a way of looking at things. And he said something in the first poem in that book, which I think resonates with the character Eliot and his approach to the world. What he said was, most modern writing sounds like a war against love. That's in a poem at the start of Translations from the Natural World called Kimberley Brief. A war against love. And I think in lots of ways that in writing Patience, I was trying to write a war for love. What Eliot wants is he wants love, he wants escape, he wants to make friends. He wants to make friends with this boy called Jim who's just arrived on the ward. And in his looking, it's a way of loving the world. In his looking at things as careful as he can, he is trying to participate in the world, to grab part of it, to seize it, and to possess it in some way. Because he can't physically grab and he can't possess the few possessions he has birthdays and Christmas cards from his family who he never sees. I think what Les Murray has there is an attempt to sort of grab things from the inside in a sense. His Lyre Bird, he gives it to us in terms of sound, but he also gives it in terms of play. Now, I'm glad to be able to talk about poetry because most of the time I talk about prose, I talk about storytelling. That's what I teach. And if I'm asked to talk somewhere else or to write something, it will tend to be about stories, about short stories or about novels. But poetry was the first thing that I wanted to write. It was the first kind of language, apart from maybe song lyrics by the Beatles or something, that really enthused me. And it certainly wasn't the kind of poetry that we were given at school. The prose we were given at school always seemed to be John Steinbeck, Rural American Poverty, which didn't really have much to do with me growing up in Ampthill, Bedfordshire and wanting to get on a spaceship and leave. What the animal poems we were given were in this big anthology with a dark blue cover and a fierce-looking dragon on the front were generally animal poems. They generally give animal poems to children to write, or they used to. And the animal poems that we were given tended to be by Ted Hughes. Now, Ted Hughes wrote Hawk in the Rain, a collection. He wrote Hawk Roosting, Thrushes, Pike. Ted Hughes's poems about animals tended to be about brooding, melancholic, and vicious animals. Animals that, strangely, were a bit like Ted Hughes. But I think that children, when they're playing animals, when they're thinking about animals, they don't have that attitude. It's not about brooding on the eternal evil of the universe. What they are seeing is some kind of fun in being an animal, some kind of freedom, some physical freedom of expression or of sound. And I think that I don't believe that if you give me a poem by Les Murray, if you'd shown that to me instead of Hawk Roosting, I'd have liked it any better. But I think I could have seen in it someone who was having fun with the words, and I think I could have heard in it, a bit like I heard in things like Lewis Carroll, the Jabberwocky, and those kind of animal poems, which I loved, not real animals. I think that in that I would have seen someone who could convey something like that the animals aren't just brooding, that they're having some fun. That lyre bird is actually performing. It's hovering like a note in an orchestral score. It's not a sort of punishment for it to be an animal. And the giving of poetry to me at school, certainly earlier on, was taken as a kind of punishment. I really didn't want to be forced to go back to things. So if I wrote something once, that was it. I didn't want to have to engage with what I'd written. It was going back to my own vomit. If I was a dog, it was going back to something that I got rid of. I got it out of me. And it took quite a while for me to develop a sense that the going back was actually part of the whole thing of writing, and that the pleasure that Les Murray has created in that poem is one of return. The syllables return, the sounds return, mirrored, lyrical, and rim, those kind of sounds. And they bounce along. It's like a pebble skipping. He has a kind of deep pleasure in the sounds that he's creating. And I think in that sense, a bit like being a singer or something, and also in being a cook, you're allowed to enjoy that. You're allowed to take pleasure in your own cooking. And when you see people in cooking programs, they taste it and they're, oh, that's delicious. I think he's not owning the language in that sense, saying, oh, this word is mine. I've kind of invented this. What he's doing is saying, isn't language such a wonderful thing? And in that sense, his phrase, most modern writing seems like a war against love, is key, because I think I was brought up on writers like Ted Hughes and also T.S. Eliot, who they are warring against something, and there is a kind of aggression in them, which I think isn't there in Les Murray. He is a more pliant writer. He's more fleet-footed. He's maybe less pressured by lots of these sort of psychic hatreds, maybe, of Eliot and T.S. Eliot, that is, not mine, and also of Ted Hughes. What I was hoping for in the writing of Patience, which isn't a poem strictly, it's a novel, it has a story, I hope it's an exciting story, but what I was hoping for in that book was to allow the language a freedom that I hadn't normally given it. And by that I mean that in a simplest way, that it's hardly punctuated. There's no commas apart from one at the very end, and that means that the sentences run on. They discover new things in themselves as they run on. But most of all, I overcame this horrible aggression towards the world that I'd been taught was modern writing, was the way that writing should go at the world. It should go at the world in a way to sort of leave a bruise, or if not, cut it right open. And that was the way that you'd made your mark on it. And I feel that with Patience, which I think I've been working towards for quite some time, I was trying to write a kind of, not horrible, not makes you sick, but poetic prose, in that any phrase, anything that was said could develop into something else, could be fruitful. But the key, most of all, was not a war on love, but was actually loving. Eliot loves the world. He thinks it is an adorable place, and particularly animals, particularly the things that he sees in it. And he treasures the fact that he was able to see them so well, that he's got good eyesight, but not only that he's able to spend time to send his vision into them and to get back from them something that he can then reproduce in words in some way, that he can imagine it, and then he can take words like succinct or distinct, and they have a pleasure, they have a a succinctness and a distinctness of their own. So that's what I hope came across from Les Murray and his writing and his wonderful approach to animals. And I think that book, Translations from the Natural World, is a really great book. That's what I hope came across into the writing of my own novel Patience, and particularly into the writing of that little Greenfinch. Thank you.